attention from the broader public. But that's the situation that we are finding ourselves in lately in the last few years, at least here in the US. Some of the pressures behind these disagreements, they've been simmering for years. But I think it's safe to say that we've reached a boiling point on many of these issues simultaneously in the last few years. And it's largely been in these years as we've had the pandemic and in the recovery years since then. Now, I'm going to offer just a partial list of some of the education controversies that are happening here in the US right now. So, for example, there's a lot of controversy around teaching about race and racism in American history and in our current society today. There's also a lot of controversy about discussions on sex, gender, sexuality, and school policies that try to accommodate students who identify as transgender. And there's also, surprisingly, it's become increasingly controversial to even talk about civics education or democracy and the role of democracy and what democratic engagement looks like. Also, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, these are conversations that are not limited to compulsory education only, but they also touch on years of higher education. So in higher ed, the issues are looking at academic freedom on college campuses, the need or no need for safe spaces to accommodate interests, students, different identities, and the openness of academic discussions to conservative viewpoints. Of course, these controversies are not only playing out in the US, but they're happening across the world. And we're going to hear some interesting perspectives on what those look like. Oftentimes, as we talk about these conversations, or about these controversies, I think oftentimes a media narrative that gets thrown around is that it's often reduced to the interests of those who have power. And so whether that's white politicians or perhaps rich billionaires, maybe it's the social media platforms, school board members who are making decisions, professors who lead their classroom and have liberal perspectives. Consequently, those with opposing viewpoints who want to challenge some of those that power, they're trying to find ways to disrupt that power. And while I do think that power is certainly an important part of these ongoing curriculum wars, I also want to advance the observation that the heart of these discussions is about social reproduction. In other words, what we teach now shapes the direction and the society that society takes moving forward. So really, these become questions about what kind of society do we want to advance and hand to the next generation. And do we feel the social change that we've experienced in our lifetimes, has this been beneficial social change? And of course, we all come from different perspectives and we have different vantage points on whether that social change has been for good or for ill. Who is this social change benefiting? And who is and so there's a lot of open questions. So in other words, these conversations get heated precisely because they're about our kids and they're about our shared society and what we think it should look like. So I encourage all of us to keep that framing in mind as we explore these different facets of the curriculum wars. And with that, let me now introduce my panelists with me. First, here immediately to my left is Cindy Mi. Cindy is an Eisenhower Fellow from China. She was in the 2020 Eisenhower Fellow cohort. She is the founder and CEO of VIPKid, an online platform, and we'll let Cindy talk about that in just a moment. Next to Cindy is Bernadine Vester. She is an Eisenhower Fellow from 2002 from New Zealand, and she is the director of EducationPlus Auckland, and we'll hear more about her work in just a moment. Next, Prem Yadav. He is an Eisenhower Fellow from 2010 cohort from India, and he is the co-founder and CEO of Pratham Infotek Foundation. And finally, at the end, we have Samuel Vilchez Santiago. He is a global scholar from 2022. He is the Florida State Director of the American Business Immigration Coalition. Okay, and with that, so why don't we go ahead and let our panelists each introduce themselves. So Cindy, why don't you please start us off? Why don't you please introduce yourself and tell us about the educational challenge that you're trying to solve?
Sure.
And we have wireless mics.
Okay,
so we'll
thank you.
between.
So my name is Cindy. I'm the fellow from 2020, and we're the online class. I'm very happy to see my fellow classmates in person for the first time, and all of you. So the educational challenge that I've been working on for the past 25 years is to create a global classroom where we can inspire and empower every child for the future through learning a foreign language, and also to unleash the potential of the world's best educators through building an online platform so that they can teach and feel the sense of achievement in the online classroom. And then in terms of VIPKid, the company that I co-founded and built for the past 10 years, previously I was in brick and mortar offline classrooms. So it's an online platform that connects teachers from North America, mostly in the US, and then students from Asia, mostly previously from China these days, from Korea, from Japan, and also from local US elementary schools for reading and math. So the online classroom, we provide technology, platform, the content, and also teacher training and development. So in order to address that educational challenge, which is a global classroom, the work in the past 10 years, we've served over 1.4 million students and also 200,000 teachers. And through that experience, we delivered 200 million one-on-one online classes, and we've created about $2 billion income for our teachers. So that's the introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. Bernadine.
Kia ora everybody, that's Māori for welcome and hello and thank you. Education isn't just nation building, it's also community building, and my fellowship in 2002 was about the relationship between education and community. And my whole career has really been about equity in education and how we actually ensure that everybody is included in education policy and delivery. So essentially I was the chief executive for a community organisation which was sponsored by local government in South Auckland. South Auckland is one of New Zealand's challenging communities. It is highly diverse. It has the largest Māori population in New Zealand. And there are challenges around how education is delivered for Pacific people and Māori students in particular in our area.
Yeah. Prem, go ahead.
Namaste everyone. I'm Prem Yadav, 2010 fellow. When I actually came to US for my fellowship, it was multi-nation fellowship, and we gather here, and my topic was to come here and understand how the US is delivering the e-education for all at the school level. And at that time in India, the computer education or education through computer was about only 7% in the public school. So I wanted to how we can actually replicate the model what US is doing. But when I came here and I saw it's almost like what we were doing in India, and there are some good project I see here, and we try to replicate the same. Even today, after 13 years, only 38% schools in India, in public school, have computers or education through computers. It's still a long way to go. As a Pratham Infotek Foundation, what we are trying to do, we are trying to provide access to technology in school, in public school. Through this, we are trying to bridge the digital divide. The second, we are training school teachers, the public school teacher, to adopt technology in day-to-day education. That is the key area we are working on. And the third most, in public school, what we have found, there is a lot of investment through the government, different schemes. Lot of equipment is there, but it is not, the usage of it is merely 10 to 20%. So we wanted to, the productive usage of the equipment or the investment provided by the government. That is what the Pratham Infotek is trying to do. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Does it work? Yeah, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Samuel. I am one of the 2022 Global Scholars. Just graduated last year from the University of Oxford. And I'm also the Florida City Director at the American Business Immigration Coalition. We're a national bipartisan group, mostly of employers that focuses on finding solutions to our nation's broken immigration system. So we come to this issue of immigration from a perspective of wanting to increase access to post-secondary education for newly arrived immigrant students at the national level, and at the intersection primarily of education policy and immigration policy. And we do this both through direct advocacy, but also obviously also by empowering local grassroots organizations that are doing the work, like the organizations mentioned here. I come to this work from my own personal perspective. When I came to this country in 2010, I came as a political asylee. My political asylum was approved fairly quickly in about 3 months. Right now, if I will have come today, that probably will take about 12 years just to get a hearing. So when I was about to graduate from high school, I had friends who had gotten here since they were like 2 years old. They were 14 years in, and basically when they went to apply to college, the system said, you're not eligible for financial aid, you basically qualified as an international student. And I was like, how come me, who's only been here for maybe 3 years, the system sees me as more deserving or more American than my classmates and my peers who have been here since they were 2 years old. So we got involved in that intersection of immigration and education policy, and I've been doing this for about 10 years or so.
Great, thank you, Samuel. So the topic of this discussion is about curriculum wars, or these controversies or conflict within education and education policy. I'd be curious, why don't we start off by just asking, what does some of that conflict look like in your countries or in the area that you're working in? And just quickly go around and say what you feel like the main controversy is. Maybe Cindy, why don't you start?
Okay.
And then just quickly just kind of set the stage a little bit.
Sure. So I come from China, and the area I work in is ESL, Learning English. Both for China and also for learning English, I think the shortage come from threefold. One is the short supply of teachers. I think it's always a problem that English teachers don't speak proper English, right? So not to mention that there are, like especially in Asia, a shortfall of American, British, or Canadian teachers who can teach locally, especially during the pandemic. And secondly, I would say that the shortfall is the content. Curriculum has been aged. So why did he use curriculum, for example, is New Concept English. That's curriculum from 40 years ago. So it's also a lot of books, but then it lacks the interactive element of technology where you keep the kids engaged, not just in the classroom, but also outside the classrooms. And then lastly, I think is the assessments. That is also a challenge because you can't always have the end of semester, end of school year assessments. You want to make sure that you understand where the kids are in their learning. So those challenges, I think, are essential to children who learn English in China. Especially in the countries where English is not the first language. You don't have English-speaking environment, and also in the sector where I work in.
Yeah, right now in the U.S., there is a lot of struggle over teacher shortages. That was your leading comment, and of course, we don't struggle with shortages of native English speakers here, but we have shortages of teachers in STEM subjects, science, math, but also foreign languages too. So, Bernadine?
I think to answer this question, I have to kind of preface my remarks that I'm suffering from political withdrawal right now, because right now it's election day, and there's a news blackout in New Zealand on the day that people vote, right? But part of that election debate has been about language and the place of language in curriculum, and in particular Māori language. And to kind of give an understanding about what that is, I have to tell a story. It's only short, but it's about Queen Victoria, who sent a man, all the way to New Zealand to sign a treaty with these tribes, native tribes. And that treaty was about sovereignty and possession of all their lands and their precious things. That treaty has been an ongoing debate in New Zealand now since 1840. In the 1980s, that debate surfaced again with what we would call a Māori Renaissance. But it also coincided with debates about sex education. And we had a very reformist government at the end of the 1980s, which reformed the education system and turned every school into what's called a self-managing school. So we still have a state education system with a national curriculum, but every school has its own board of trustees, and the trustees are elected by the parents of the children who attend the school. They were originally called charter schools, and some of you might recognise that name. We no longer refer to them as charter schools. You'd think that this would solve some problems, and it did. So one of the things that it did do is it resolved that requirement that any change in curriculum, especially sex education, right, had to be consulted first with parents. And what that did do is it actually diluted that debate so much so that now we don't have debates about sex education in schools, we don't have LGBT debates, because all of those decisions are actually made at the local level. But what we do have is a brand new history curriculum now, and that's about national history, because we've never been taught in our schools about our own history. And it's a history, of course, of colonialism. And part of that 1989 resolution for self-managing schools was that Māori were allowed to set up their own schools, and did. And Māori now are able to learn their own language in their own schools. But a treaty is about two partners. And if the rest of us don't understand the language, it still becomes a very separatist issue. So what we're currently grappling with at the moment is how much Māori can be taught in everybody's school, and what is the place of Māori in nationhood. Right. So political debates come down to the very smallest, most minor, most useless debate, which is bilingual road signs, which I know in Europe has been an issue, but actually has been resolved. But now we're worried about, the little things like the weather on the television being in Māori and in English, and the mixing of those two languages in a very New Zealand style. So that's the challenge that we're actually dealing with in curriculum in New Zealand at the moment.
Great. Prem, go ahead.
Yeah. So in India there is an organization called ASER. ASER is Annual Status Education Report. They are the citizen-led assessment. They do a large assessment every year. Since 2005, they are doing till last year. Only in COVID 2 years, it was not happened. So it's a rural assessment for school-going children. Every year, ASR do about 700,000 tests, the student test, and it is all about the foundational literacy and numeracy test. So to understand the status of children, those who are going school, whether they are learning or not. So since 2005, this ASR is doing this assessment, and the result since 2005, still it is not much change. The result is this grade 5 student, if you given the level 2 text to read, only 55% children are able to read. It means there is a lot of children, they are spending 5 years, but they are not able to even read level 2 text. The same way, if you ask them grade 5 children to do division, only 27% children are able to do the division. So even they are doing 5 year schooling, and a lot of children are lagging behind at the level they should be. So basically what I'm trying to say, the number, the survey number, government is not actually accepting. That's a key area where if the diagnosis or the number reports, any survey report are not accepted, evidences are not accepted, you don't plan, evidence is not accepted, the plan is not to achieve or diagnose those things. So since last 2 years, even government has, the Indian government has started doing NAS, the National Sample Survey, on the same basis, and exactly the same number they have found. And now we see a lot of changes throughout the new education policy accepted by the government of India 2020. Also, there is a national curriculum framework. The basis is changed. Earlier it was 3 plus 3 plus 5 plus 4. Now it is, they started investing from pre-primary education. So like early 3 years, so from 3 years, earlier it was from 6th year to 14 year. Now it is from age group 3. Also accepted in the government. Budgetary provision is made. It's a large number because we are 1.4 billion population country. So there's a huge investment in the early years for education. So basically what I'm trying to make a point, mostly the government don't accept number if it is not on the scale in India. So this ASR actually made us possible to accept this number, and the government itself started doing this kind of survey, and they started planning on a larger scale. So now through this new education policy, the foundational literacy and numeracy become a nationwide program. That's one thing I just wanted to mention. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So accountability pressures, performance pressures, and how to measure that and standardizing that. That's definitely has been a hot topic in the U.S. as well. Thank you.
I think what's interesting about the U.S. is that because of our federal nature of our institutions, we have every state dictating most of the educational policies that the students actually go through. So instead of just one national education policy, you end up with 50 different policies in different states going in different trends. And in many ways, you know, Florida is the battleground for the educational wars we're seeing right now. And I will divide those wars in two camps. The first one is related to access. So like, for instance, we just saw the Supreme Court go against racial affirmative action. When we also talk about the whole conversation around school choice, whether a kid goes to a public school or charter school, which is a semi-public institution, or if they go to a private school and if they get vouchers. Then we're looking at issues like the immigration issue. So should immigrant students who have no legal status, should they be able to go and access public funding to go to school? And even when we talk about, you know, the defunding of diversity and inclusion programs at the collegiate level across the country, right? So that's one side. The second one is related to content, and that's primarily around the history of who we are, including issues related to race, racial divisions in our society, slavery, etc., and then also primarily around gender and sexuality. So we're seeing that play out across the country. I mean, in my home state, we've seen book bans happen at the local level. I went recently to my high school, and I was talking to one of my teachers, and I noticed that there were no books in the bookshelves in the classroom. And I asked, why is that? And she basically said, because of the new state law, if I put out a book that the state, that gets challenged by a parent, and the state finds that it's not age appropriate, then the teacher individually could face the consequences, whether criminal or some level of liability, for having that book in the classroom. And she said, I had hundreds of books. Obviously, I haven't read all of them. It's really difficult for me to have books. So just as a matter of precaution, she decided to take off all the books from the bookshelves. And that's a conversation we're having across the country. So I will say those two, access and then curriculum content.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm hearing in your responses is a combination of political conversations, or sort of the role of various groups within societies, and how they're trying to manage. Are there also conversations that just drive specifically on sort of instruction or academic areas? Prem, your conversation about India was really focused on academics and trying to improve. But you also described a national curriculum in 2020. Is that right? Yeah. It was India, of course, is a very large country, a lot of different regions. Were there political consequences with that national curriculum?
Actually, this 2020 national education policy came into after 36 years. So it was a lot of deliberation happened before actually it came to the pass in the parliament. Yeah, but there was a huge, as you said, there's a huge, almost like we speak 350 languages. There is 27 different states. So basically, there is also rural and urban divide. So keeping everything, that languages, these barriers. So there's a lot of deliberation happen before actually come to the consensus. Even the central government, that we have a central team who actually take care of the curriculum framework. But still, the local state government, they also have the power to actually, based on the guideline provided by the national government, they can design the curricula. So there is a consensus between the central and the state to come to create to the national curriculum framework, to follow the curriculum framework. So that's a huge, actually, responsibility of the local state government as well. Okay,
great, thank you. Are there other areas? So Bernadine, you mentioned a lot of conflict over social, but are there academic sort of conflicts that are arising?
Yes, but I think this is a different dimension to them. Mm-hmm. In New Zealand. We do have a national curriculum. We've had one for 20 years. We're currently reviewing it, and the history curriculum is the big change. But the debate since COVID really has been about dropping standards. New Zealand, alongside Finland, used to be held up as the best literacy and numeracy rates around the world, or the best education system. But we've dropped, but only actually in comparison, right? So we haven't improved, we've plateaued. So it looks like standards are falling, even though they've just plateaued. But of course it's become a political football. You must teach literacy and numeracy for 2 hours every day in the primary schools. And it's becoming almost like it's a debate about telling teachers how to teach, which is about the same as telling surgeons how to operate or telling mechanics how to fix their car. You know, you can't. It's a very deprofessionalising debate when you end up having people telling you how to teach, because we all know that actually if you base teaching strategies on the science of delivery, then you are more likely to have better outcomes because it's evidence-based. But, you know, as you said at the beginning, curriculum is a very boring topic because it's a very professional topic, and because, you know, the only thing that the public really wants to know is, are the kids learning to read and write? And so the debate in New Zealand is, well, it doesn't seem like they are.
So some of these, at least in the U.S., a lot of these conflicts, they really sparked around COVID with the pandemic. Cindy, how has the pandemic contributed to or sparked controversy in education in China?
I would say the pandemic, like anywhere else, like especially in the U.S., I think one topic that's been talked a lot about is the learning loss, right, during pandemic, which has been magnified through the imbalance of the school and everything. And then similarly in China, at the beginning, it was quite challenging when there's longer time that kids cannot go to school. And then what is a learning loss? How can parents help children to learn at home and all that? And then you're measured by the end of your school semester the same way, right? And then you have to go to middle school, high school, and all that. So I think one thing that happened was tutoring become much more demanded in China. I think similarly in the US, you would have more children join online classes. And then in Europe, similarly, you will see more demands in that way. But then that raised another challenge, how children's time should be allocated. School hours is challenging, and then there's the after school hours. So that was a topic that's been debated as well.
Okay. Does anybody else want to piggyback on talking about how COVID has accelerated conflict in your neck of the woods from your perspective?
I think to your point around tutoring, I think in the U.S. we saw the educational gap increase among those who had the ability to get private tutoring and those who didn't get the ability to do so, especially as parents were debating whether or not, you know, they could be in a position to go back to work. There were states that opened up the schools much more quicker than other states. So that definitely played a role. And then in general, the whole COVID conversation in the United States was very politicized. So it definitely, education was at the forefront also of that politicization. And it's interesting to see how a lot of our educational wars are mostly focused on the political, when before we used to have other sorts of debate around testing and the role of testing in our classrooms, et cetera. And now that's kind of taking a secondary, if you say, presence in the conversation around education.
I think that one of the things about COVID has been that it's heightened inequalities. You know, the families who did not have immediate access to broadband, for example, even in our most urban communities, there were families who couldn't access broadband, so they couldn't access the online learning that was actually taking place and which was actually available in the wealthier schools and those areas. So yes, you know, COVID has made it more challenging to deliver programs.
Prem, did you want to add on here?
Yeah. So what we have found through this ASER survey, there's a lot of learning level dropped out. So last year report we published, and this year, so it's about more than 10 to 12%. Some in urban area and more than 20 to 25% in the rural area. And the reason behind this was, as she said, there was access to technology, access to internet, and access to devices. So basically access to devices, urban versus rural, we found very at a very low level in the rural area, and access to broadband in rural area was almost like very few of the almost the remote area don't have that kind of access, so they were deprived to the online learning. And so also what we have found, the good quality of the online education, online content. So there was a lot in last 2-3 years for basically I'm speaking about the primary education and the elementary education. Higher grade we have a good content, but for the lower level, because even in the public school we don't have. But last 3 years there's a lot of even the government efforts, the private player efforts. We have now good content, but it's positive side of the COVID. We have a lot of good online content available now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, taking that idea from talking about technology, so I'm just sort of piggybacking off of what you've just said. What is the role of technology in accelerating or contributing to these curriculum wars or other conflict within education? From my vantage point, it seems that social media and those kinds of things are certainly part of this conversation. What do you see in your countries?
I think the impact of social media, it has been one of the conversations that's been had over the course of this election, has been about the mental health of young people, and the mental health issues arise from the use of social media. There has been a little bit of, so from one party has said, if you elect us, we will ban technology from classrooms, which feels to me unhelpful. But maybe that's my own political bias here. But lots of schools do, from a school perspective, limit the use of devices in classrooms. But devices can also be technology, can also be tools for learning. So it's actually about, and I think that debate is still happening, about the extent to which social media and devices can actually support learning as well as undermine it.
Samuel, as our Gen Z representative.
I think you also see social media fueling the polarization, right? Like in two ways, particularly. The first one is the way information gets spread and taken. And I've seen there's been a lot of cases where I go on social media and I see a lot of misinformation about what a certain book says versus what it actually doesn't say. And that gets sensationalized in the regular traditional media. And then you start getting a lot of people talking about these different issues around content primarily. And then on the second hand is the technology, and particularly social media, allows you to build communities around these issues. So for instance, I'm in Orlando, which is in Central Florida. My county is Orange County. In our past school board meeting last week, we had people from all over the state come and challenge certain books that were at a school's library, right? Why does a parent from Virginia care about what a student in Orlando is reading in their library? So what they have access to. And a lot of it is because social media has allowed for these different communities to gather together and be able to mobilize and organize better.
So I have a different experience. So we are in AI generation. Most basically, when you use social media, based on the click you do, they provide that kind of the content, and it restricts your learning. That is what we have saw, because almost most of the time, it's like basically we use social media for entertainment, not for the learning. Very few percentage of people, actually what we have seen, we did a survey and we found very few percentage of them, they use social media for learning or they use in education. So, but that is what we found, it restricts the area of different learning to the student.
Okay. So Cindy, of course, is leading an educational technology company. So what do you think about the role of technology?
You know I have a lot to say about this, right? So I think a technology platform solves so many problems in terms of the teacher supply. It connects teachers anywhere and then allows that teacher to teach synchronously or asynchronously across the globe. It also helps build interactive, engaging interface in the content itself that allows students to learn at their own pace. And also I think that for assessment, it just can show us how the students are progressing and give that data to the teacher and help the teacher to teach. So I of course think technology is good rather than evil. And in the use cases, for example, I think we've been recently having American teachers coaching a group of Saudi Arabia teachers to teach English. They need to improve their English level, but also the methodology of teaching to encourage the kids all the time is admirable for Saudi teachers to learn from our fellow American teachers. And also in terms of rural education, I think it makes so much sense that for teachers to teach synchronously, streaming to classrooms in rural, like for example, countryside in China, as a program that Ms. Fu is sitting there from CEAIE, that we've been talking about how to like helping rural Chinese children to learn English, and we've implemented in many classrooms. I think the same thing can be done for students anywhere. Like there's like no teacher or no classroom, as long as there's a screen, we can do a lot of those programs to allow children to learn. So today, we're talking about AI and generative AI. The possibility of an AI tutor would allow students to progress so much faster, and it would allow a teacher to do so much less work, so they can have all these replica of teacher Cindy to teach the fundamentals where they can focus on the emotional connection with the students to encourage them. So I'm definitely a big advocate for technology in education.
I would like to have a teacher Cindy, thank you. This will be the final question that we touch on. Then we're going to have open it up for a few minutes of Q&A from the audience. And have everybody just chime in. How do we accelerate progress in education? How do we know that we're being successful? And maybe let's think big here. You know, like we don't have to do the same old things. Like what would, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to accelerate progress here in education? Maybe you want to start with Samuel?
I think primarily in the United States, you have to open up the doors of access, primarily to post-secondary education. The first 4 years, school here is really expensive. And when you start asking, Gen Zers, to your point, if they want to go to school, they say, I don't want to be in debt. Mm-hmm. So I actually think if we want to expand, access to education and allow more people to actually go through the formal education, you have to make it more accessible. And I know the federal government has taken steps recently to do so, but there's a big debate around, the affordability of our schools, primarily at the post-secondary level.
Mm-hmm.
So we always advocate evidence-based actions. So I think that is going to help the large-scale assessment, collecting evidence, and based on that evidences, if the government or any organization plan their activity, that is going to accelerate the education. So, for example, we work with I belong to Mumbai, and we work with the state called Maharashtra. And in Maharashtra, there is around 100,000 school in rural area, and around 20 million children are in the school. 97% of the population children are in the school, so they are enrolled in school. But as I mentioned, that about only 55% children are able to read or write, even if they are almost like 5-year schooling. So the situation based on the collecting evidence and planning accordingly for each child, the learning level based on the adaptive kind of learning, that is going to accelerate the learning.
That's a hard question. because I come from the point of view that poverty and educational excellence is correlated, right? And education doesn't exist in a vacuum all by itself. We've got larger non-attendance now since COVID, and that non-attendance is in those people who feel disengaged from the education system, full stop. So poverty, addressing issues of poverty, health and well-being, social well-being, will help you to raise educational outcomes as well. I've always been of the view, and this is part of my Eisenhower Fellowship 20 years ago, was that if you educate the mothers well, then the children will do well. And I think that's still true. You know, that if the mothers are stressed and are unsupported in their own homes, if they're subject to family violence, if they're not valued for who they are, then they're not going to be able to educate their children well.
I found my answers some similarity with that of Bernadine's. My magic wand would be teacher income. And there's teacher shortage, although they really want to be teachers, but it's really hard for many to stay in the profession because teachers are paid so little. So if the magic wand can be high touch and high tech, I think we can improve productivity, teacher income at the same time so that we can have a more accessible, affordable, personalized education for all. And personally, I've came from a small town in Hebei province, and I didn't even finish high school. I just taught myself English, I taught myself a bachelor degree, and later my only higher ed is in business school. And that just kept me going because I really want that global classroom, a world where children can learn and grow. But then, I mean, we're from the women class of 2020, right? And but I think the teacher I work with, 200,000 of them, 90% they're female. They're wonderful people. Our very first slogan was, join the fun, be the inspiration. It's never like earn $20 an hour, but it's really important for the teachers and even those income, right? So I mean, that magic wand is something that I really want to work on with high tech, but always the most important is the high touch with the teachers so that we can make the world a better place.
Excellent, thank you. There's a great close. And let's give it an applause for everyone. Thank you. So we do have a few minutes, and we could take some questions. I see some enthusiastic questions right here in the front row. Why don't we, on my right.
This is actually, this is a sharing because it's an Eisenhower. I think one of the meanings of Eisenhower is that we also find things together and in a way work together. I'm a fellow from 10 years ago from Finland, and in a way I have a lot of background in curricula. I did my PhD on the curricula in former Yugoslavia after the war, how it was divided, and then I worked as a Finnish State Secretary for Education on the Finnish curricula and its internationalization. But the sharing I wanted to relate to India. My Indian fellow Vishal Talhera also became a good friend 10 years ago, and we've done two things actually in the last 2 years that relate directly to curriculum, and I think both can have a global impact. The first one is Vishal and his organization started to work on something what they called happiness curriculum a few years ago, with first with a very small number of children in Bangalore region. And then Vishal reached out to me that, Bill, we would need the Finnish curricula to have us as an example. And interestingly enough, we didn't find anything in English. So then finally Vishal found a researcher who interviewed me and wrote a sort of convincing paper so that I became the advisor to give some credibility from Finland for that process. But what is inspiring with it is that it's now, I think, in about 5 or 6 states of India. And the point is that for the first hour of the day, the teachers are actually sort of really creating an atmosphere of learning. that exactly, and in particular paying attention to those children who perhaps have those tired mothers or even perhaps no mothers at all. And it's hugely successful. So this has really given back my faith on a possibility for a global scale change in basic education. But it's again based on evidence and really hard work, but also I would say here we have had a wonderful Eisenhower thing at play. And the second thing we did with Vishal last year, and this relates to also to the discussion on technology, I think we have to recognize this discussion in that it has different dimensions. But what we recognized, and a third colleague was from New Zealand, but not a fellow, that we now finally have a teaching profession has always been very national because it's national legislation and so on. So typically educators grassroots level don't recognize themselves as being part of global community. So it's a 19th century phenomenon, nation state, etc. While now after the COVID, all teachers, whether in India or China or New Zealand or Finland, used more or less the same platforms, of course in cases where schools were not closed, as was in many places as well. And therefore you for the first time actually have the technical solution and also somehow the mental perhaps thinking that we could do something together. So we wrote actually 3 articles to a paper called Diplomatic Diplomatic Quarterly with Vishal and a New Zealand colleague about global education vision, where we proposed that we should work towards 2030 some pilots on curriculum level about shared content that would be tested in different parts of the world. And we are going to work on it also seriously. So I just wanted to share this because it was about curricula.
So I think, Santiago from Jamaica, so I'm part of the 2020 fellows. I'm a co-founder of a charity in Jamaica called the Adult Learning Centers of Jamaica. It's not part of my fellowship project, but it was something I did from when I left, when I started law school. And we teach adults to read and write, to be numerate and literate, but functionally so. So we're not trying for you to be, ready to take a exit exam or an external exam, but just to be able to function in society. And the challenges that we have faced is that these are adults who never finished primary school, much less secondary school, usually poverty, crime, gang violence, a lot of, abandonment by parents. So the stories are really heart-wrenching. But one, they're motivated to learn even in their 60s, 70s. In other words, once you're 18 to 100, it doesn't matter. If you're interested in learning, we're there to teach you. But what bothers me is that our government kind of articulates this narrative that we have an over 80% literacy and numeracy rate, which is not evidenced by the people I see coming in. So my question is around standardizing, and maybe Prem, you could speak to this, of what constitutes being literate in your country and numerate in your country, because the government, it serves the government when it comes to the stats to have a very basic low level of determination. But the truth is many of these individuals cannot function in society. And we're talking about simple things like using an ABM, applying for a passport. We have a high level of remittances, so even going to a Western Union to receive money from overseas, it's just impossible because they cannot, function. And so I wanted to know if that's a challenge for you in terms of standardizing the determination of literacy and numeracy.
So unfortunately, what you said, we as a literacy level, like a foundational literacy level, literacy or numeracy level is a very low. It's not what you speak about is a 21st century skill. Nowadays, is in SDG goal also is included. So basically, in India, what 80%, 84% of literate, but the point you mentioned about, I think about 50% of them are able to do their that help them to do the thing you just mentioned. So. But one thing what we have understood from this foundational literacy and numeracy is it actually helped to get you there. So it is a just start, because a lot of people don't get that opportunity. And it's a huge number. When you actually do assessment, you see, for example, when we do these assessment in the village, children are going to school and this we do in the setup of the community, in front of the mother and the father. When we do this assessment in front of them, even they don't know the children are going school, but they are not able to do these simple things. And then that help, actually that surprise them, and then that actually help the mother and the father to spend time with the children. So we saw in a lot of places. But to answer your question, it is just a start to take you there. But if you don't invest in them, you will not able to actually reach there.
Yeah, let's go ahead, front row.
Thank you all. My name is Leonard. I am a fellow from class of 2016 and I'm from Rwanda. In most of Africa, governments are almost achieving near universal primary education and, if you will, secondary education. And so the biggest challenge right now is how to improve quality and access. And most governments on the continent in Africa are struggling to find innovators like you, Cindy, that basically can come and understand what the seemingly intractable challenges are and how to solve them using low-tech, high-tech, or no-tech solutions at all. These innovative solutions, like yours, are costly. In most public education systems on the continent, 80% of school-going children go to public schools, which, as you know, and I think some of you mentioned this, the challenges around infrastructure, building schools, is around getting the right quality of teachers, so teacher training is an issue. In my own country, Rwanda, what the government has done is, for example, bring qualified teachers from